the more administrative bureaucratic processes that we can obliterate or automate with technology, the better employee life will be. So, if I have to type in my travel expenses, it really doesn't matter how beautiful the UI is. The process of typing in travel expenses is a pretty mind-numbing exercise.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome to AI and the Future of Work, episode 293. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus, you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact. Megan Brooks writes in Medscape about how oncologists are voicing ethical concerns over AI used in cancer care. Researchers asked 204 oncologists from 37 states in the US for their views on the ethical implications of using AI for cancer treatment. 81% supported having patient consent to use an AI model during treatment decisions, and 85% felt oncologists needed to be able to explain an AI-based clinical decision model that it was used to diagnose patient issues. Most respondents felt patients should not be expected to understand how AI tools work, yet many believed patients could make their own treatment decisions based on multiple AI recommendations. Oncologists also expressed concerns about protecting patients from biased or erroneous AI, but few were confident they could do so. The findings suggest that the implementation of AI in oncology must include rigorous assessments of its impact on care decisions and clear assignment of responsibility when AI makes inaccurate diagnoses. So much more to unpack there. I'll leave that as a teaser, and of course, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. Now, shifting to today's conversation. Today's guest is one of the most interesting people on the planet, and although he's an investor in PeopleRain, I think you'll agree at the end of today's episode that I'm not just pandering. Thomas Otter joined Acadian Ventures in March 2022 as a general partner. Prior to Acadian, he advised companies such as Workday Ultimate Software, Personio, and Unit 4. Additionally, he worked with private equity and growth equity firms, including Warburg Pincus, Scottish Equity Partners PSG, and Goldman Sachs, on topics related to M&A, strategy, negotiations, and diligence. In addition to being a limited partner at Acadian, Thomas has also been an active angel investor in companies like Reveal, Growblocks, and Mackie. Previously, he led the product management organization at SAP SuccessFactors, scaling it to more than $1 billion in annual recurring revenue. He also was a research vice president at Gartner Group, where he led research in HR tech. Thomas holds a PhD and numerous other degrees from the University of Oxford, among others. He's a regular guest lecturer at several universities and a fellow of the British Computer Society. Quite a bio. Thomas grew up in South Africa and now lives in Heidelberg, Germany. And I should add, is a collector of vinyl records and, like me, a lover of great music. And without further ado, Thomas, I've been looking forward to this one. It's my pleasure to welcome you to AI and the Future of Work. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about that illustrious background and how you got into this space.
Hey, Dan, firstly, thanks for having me on the show. I'm a big fan. It's really cool to be here today. I got into HR tech by mistake. I was studying industrial relations and labor law at university, and this chap came around the university and gave us a talk about technology. And after the end of the talk, he said, anyone in this class of HR people own a computer? And this was 1992, I think, and I was the only one to put up my hand. And he said to me, Thomas, great, come see me after the class. I might have a job for you. So I went to see him and we got talking. I said, what does it pay? And he said, twice the starting salary of an HR manager. And somehow I've been involved in HR technology in some form or other ever since. So I ended up working for a mainframe vendor at the tail end of the mainframe era, and then worked for SAP in South Africa, initially as a consultant and then in pre-sales. And then SAP moved to Germany in the mid-90s, where I ended up being assistant to one of the founders of SAP, and then had a relatively successful career at SAP, moved to Gartner, and then ended up going back to SAP when they acquired SuccessFactors. And for my sins, I ended up running product there for a number of years. Then I left SAP, went back to university. As part of my midlife crisis, I did finish my PhD off. And then I really got into the advisory side of things, working with many scale-ups and startups on product strategy, go-to-market, and so on. And while I was doing that, I started to do a bit of personal investing. I also became an LP in Acadian. And after working a bit with Jason, we decided that it would make sense for us to get together and me to become a full-time VC. So I'm very much a beginner at VC, but I've got nearly 30 years now of experience in the weird world of HR technology.
We're going to talk a lot about HR tech and specifically the intersection of ethics and compliance with HR tech. But let's level set. For those who don't live and breathe HR tech like you and I, what does it even mean to you? What are all the components that go into today's HR tech landscape?
A couple of ways of thinking about it, and a good way of thinking about it is it's technology that the HR department buys. That's relatively simple. That's not all of the picture, but it's a good picture about how you think about it. And if you think about the life cycle of people at work, there's the processes of finding and recruiting people, the processes of bringing them into the organization, onboarding them, developing them, promoting them, moving them sideways, moving them downwards, moving them outwards, paying them, tracking their holidays, tracking their sickness, trying to see whether they're happy or whether they're unhappy. And basically that whole life cycle of the employee, if you think about today, technology can impact that across the board. I'm going to just pause this for 1 second and get a drink. I'm coughing. Hang on. I thought I had a drink, but I don't. So think about HR tech as being the systems that support the complete employee manager life cycle within an organization. And I'm going to give you a bit of history because you set me up for that. And I'm going to take you back to the late 1940s. And basically, that's when the computer really kicked off in a business sense. And the first business application ever was in 1951, and it was in the UK. And the first significant business application was a payroll. And it's a fascinating story. It's a company called Lions Tea Room, and that was like the McDonald's of the day. And they had some of their employees that worked on computing at Bletchley Park in the war, and they realized the power of the computer, and they decided to apply it. They wanted to apply it to business, and this was the first company that really did that. And they did it in two ways. One of the things, they did a stock taking inventory system, and then they did the payroll. And what they did is, over the course of 2 years, and it only took them 2 years, they built the payroll, but they also built the computer. So in that time, in that 2 years, they actually invented payroll software, and they actually built the computer, invented the computer that ran literally soldered and welded the computer together and built this payroll. And it really revolutionized payroll completely in the 1950s. And this company then spun that out into a payroll service bureau in the 1950s, and it processed hundreds of thousands of employees' payroll in the UK by the mid-1950s. HR tech has really, from the beginning, been really part of the evolution of business computing. And then if we move it forward, a few years, we look to the first use of the internet in a commercial context, at least in the legal, ethical sense, was the job board. And if you think about an industry that was completely turned on its head in a very short period of time, it was the job advertising business. If you think back to when our parents looked for jobs, they opened the newspaper on a Sunday and there was this, massive hundreds of pages of job adverts in the Sunday newspaper, and that's how people found jobs. HR tech completely revolutionized that process. Similarly, the first use of the browser in the enterprise was employee self-service. So it's a weird thing that HR tech is often at the forefront of technology innovation in the enterprise, yet we often see the HR function often as being backwards in terms of technology adoption. So there's this weird paradox with HR and technology, which I find fascinating.
So you and I recall a time when HR wouldn't have been considered strategic to the business. It was for compliance and it was a shared service, but it was just to keep the lights on function for the business. And now we talk about the employee experience as being such a fundamental part of how enterprises create value. What's changed? And then more importantly, where are we headed?
So there's a bit of a debate on that. So I'd like it to be that the organizations think that HR is strategic, but many organizations don't. I think most organizations realize that their people are important. I don't think most organizations have actually figured out HR yet, but I think they've figured out the idea that people are important to running a business. It should be fairly obvious, but it's amazing how many organizations in the past didn't really think that. But there's a lot of focus on trying to make the workplace more inclusive, make the workplace more productive, make organizations more attractive, and so on. And part of that is due to a simple problem of demographics, in the sense that there are massive shortages of workers in particular geographies and in particular jobs, on particular skills and in particular programs, whether it's plumbers on the one hand, whether it's retail workers, whether it's restaurant staff, or whether it's data scientists. All across the world, we're in a position at the moment of having the lowest levels of unemployment pretty much that we've ever had. And so companies find it really hard to find people. So there's just simple supply and demand. It says that organizations are going to have to be smarter and pay more attention to finding and keeping their people.
We had a version of this conversation with a great recent guest, Josh Burson. I think you know Josh.
Yeah, Josh and I, we go back way back.
I'd imagine.
Yeah.
It's a small community. Wrote a book called Irresistible, and he talks about the total employee experience and what it means to make the workplace someplace employees love to go. I don't mean just the physical workplace, but that whole work experience is something that employees embrace. What is the role of technology in creating these experiences at work that transcend the traditional kind of work as a four-letter word relationship that humans have historically had with their jobs?
So the best software in the workplace is software that you don't see. So the more administrative bureaucratic processes that we can obliterate or automate with technology, the better employee life will be. So, if I have to type in my travel expenses, it really doesn't matter how beautiful the UI is. The process of typing in travel expenses is a pretty mind-numbing exercise. So if I can automate away the process of travel expense submission through clever scanning and clever other technologies, then I make the employee life, the employee work experience better. So part of making the employee work experience better is by obliterating as much of the administration as you possibly can. So I think, to me, that's the fundamental building block of a good employee experience, is when you make the painful tasks go away, or you make them as simple and straightforward and painless as possible. So that's a big fundamental part of it. So it's the core administrative stuff that you can't get away from. You do need to, if you are sick, you do need to, say why you're sick. If you're taking holidays, you need to record the fact that you're taking holiday. If you've lost your pay information, you need to get it. You need to get a copy for the tax man. Those daily, lively bureaucratic processes are a big part of HR, like it or not. And then there's a second level of the processes, which is the processes that actually help you do your job better. So is it finding colleagues that you can collaborate with? Is it developing your skills? Is it building your team better? Is it, the processes that make the work itself more productive and more enjoyable? And there's a whole heap of technologies aimed at that as well. Just kind of both those things. It's the obliteration of administrative burdens, and it's also, augmenting the experience in doing your job, learning more, connecting with colleagues, and so on. And technology can play a role in both those clumps, if you like.
Several years back, you published your opus, Externalities in Enterprise Software, Helping and Hindering Legal Compliance, nearly 500 pages of Thomas Otter research and musings. And one of the ways you and I hit it off was thinking about how the logical extension of a lot of what you talk about in your work extends to the current discussions that we're having about AI and the ethics of AI and how that intersects with technology in the workplace. Maybe talk about how, first of all, just the origins of that paper, and maybe just to abstract for the audience, and then how that has helped your thinking about the space evolve.
Yeah. So I've always been, for a long time, I've been interested in the intersection between law and software. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a bit of a legal background. I did a master's in law initially looking at data protection law. because I've always been fascinated about when software and law meet. And sometimes software can help people and organizations obey the law. And sometimes software is a mechanism by which you break the law, right? And sometimes software ignores the law, and sometimes software creates unintended consequences as it relates to law. And that world has always interested me. And, if you think about payroll, going back to what I mentioned about payroll, payroll really exists to help organizations comply with tax legislation, right? That's really what it's about. And there's this curious symbiotic relationship between regulators and software companies, right? And it actually works quite well. Every time that there's an improved technology, it seems that there's a new way of governments collecting money from us. So today, for instance, in the UK, there is this thing called the real-time taxation posting. So every month, the government's able to collect tax from the employees, which governments love because it means they get their money quicker. But that would have been impossible, 20 years ago, because the payroll interfaces didn't exist. So this relationship's always fascinated me, and payroll is one of those examples. And then I looked at areas where maybe it doesn't work so well, and one of the areas where it doesn't work so well is in accessibility. We create software today which makes it impossible for people with visual impairment to use the software. And when you think about that from a human rights perspective, that's pretty disgusting, right? We build things that humans can't build. If we built software that said, okay, I don't know, white people can't use it, or women can't use it, or men can't use it, we'd all be up in arms about how, unethical and unfair that is. Yet, most software companies today build software which, 15% of the population can't use properly. And yet there are laws in place around accessibility, yet they're largely ignored by the software industry. So I explored, some of the reasons why that is and perhaps how we could fix it. And then I looked at an example where the software industry had taken the law and made an industry out of it itself. And that came off the back of Sarbanes-Oxley, which was, those of you that remember, was a series of regulations that were passed after Enron and Tyco Foods and a couple of those other major malfeasances in terms of corporate compliance. And basically what Sarbanes-Oxley did is to put in the rules around that companies need to do a much better job of auditing themselves. And on the back of that, basically almost overnight, a new software industry sprung up, which is GRC. Right. Basically, within 6 months, we had a 6 billion software industry on the back of Sarbanes-Oxley, and the regulators never envisioned that this would be a software industry. So it was these weird areas of how software and law interact and sometimes work together well, sometimes don't work together well. That's kept me interested. And if we look at, I also looked at GDPR and data protection. So that's another area of mixed success or failure, but the idea of your data as part of you and you as a citizen deciding, how and where that data is used, and that's an extension of you as a person and of your human rights, is fairly well enshrined in European legal history, but less so in the US. And there's this debate between privacy as a human right and privacy as a property or something that you can trade. And so that's had tremendous influences on both law and then also on the software industry. And as we look at AI today, we're having similar discussions, and some of the frameworks that look at regulation and ethics and so on that you can apply to privacy and you can apply to other things, you can also apply to AI. So some of the concepts we're talking about today of responsible AI and so on, you can take that lineage back into data protection and into some of the other areas of computer related legislation. Probably, hey, I can go on with this all. Let me pause and let you get a question in. Hang on.
So we're at this fascinating point in the history of, call it software, the history of technology for work, where there's this confluence of events happening, an evolution of what you just discussed, but vendors and AI first software and customers and regulatory bodies, regulation, the intersection of that is so nascent, and we don't really have a way to assess the ethical implications of AI making bad decisions that impact employees. So you've got the vendor saying, we just write the algorithms and publish the software. If the customer uses bad data, that then goes and uses our algorithms to make bad decisions, customer's fault. And the customer, of course, says, you sold us the software. We didn't write the algorithms, right? You just told us where to put the data. We did exactly what you told us to do. And the regulators are caught in the middle trying to figure out who's responsible. Is it the publisher? Is it the data owner? Is it the distributor?
Yeah.
And my concern is that this train left the station, right? It is speeding down the tracks, but there's no conductor in the train. The cargo doors are open. Passengers aren't seated, no seat belts. It feels like we're on a collision course. Where do you put that kind of in terms of ultimately we're trying to protect the health and safety of humans, employees? What should be done to try to stop the speeding train?
I think there's two things about AI and regulation. And the one that everyone talks about is, we need new regulations to regulate AI. And yes, we do need some new regulations to regulate elements of AI. The thing that a lot of people don't talk about, because it's a little bit more uncomfortable, is that existing regulations apply whether you use AI or not. So if you have, if you build some software and it's some clever software using a bit of AI and it only awards bank loans to men, you are going to get completely, the word beginning with F, over by a bunch of financial regulators. Whether you use, it's got nothing to do with AI. You've discriminated against somebody in your loan practices, then you're going to get hauled up in front of some regulatory body, and you're going to get your ass fined.
But what if all the actors in that transaction can plausibly claim that they're not responsible? Who's responsible if that loan decision is made, in favor of males?
Ultimately, in that context, it's courts are quite good at figuring these things out. I'm not so worried about that. I'm not so worried about that scenario. When it becomes such that we got a case going on in HR tech at the moment, which is quite interesting with one of the major vendors, a person's, made 40 applications, and that's an interesting one. And what's interesting about that is not the AI bias part of that question. It's actually about the question that relates to who's the employer. So if a software vendor is promising that their software automates your whole business process, makes decisions on your behalf, then in essence, you as an employer A has essentially outsourced part of the employment relationship to vendor B, who happens to be a software company. So then you start to think about where does the liability lie, and then we get into employment law, and you can use employment law precedents from outsourcing and from other areas to figure that out. So I'm not so concerned about those use cases. What I'm hoping is that, like the EEOC is doing, is they're actually starting to step up and learn about AI and look at how AI applies to existing regulations. And so people building software, I think, they want to automate something using AI, then they need to understand what it is they're trying to automate and understand the legal frameworks of that. If it's a contract you're doing, if you're automating VAT invoicing, then you need to know a lot about that, right? And so the legislation that exists already, law is a really clever thing. It tends to, people that don't know about laws think about it as being slow and clumsy, and lawyers don't know anything about technology. We've had waves and waves of technology evolution over the last several hundred years. Law has been remarkably good in its own way of dealing with it, right? It's never perfect. It is sometimes slow. It is sometimes clumsy. But, I have deep respect for the legislative and regulatory processes as they generally function. When you look at how industrial standards emerge, how those are consumed by regulation and so on, it's really quite a beautiful thing. And I think regulators and law, how common law and how laws evolve, and it gets a lot of bad rap. But I actually think that we should be giving the regulatory systems more credit than sometimes we perhaps do. But AI does raise some new and challenging, ethical questions. And this relates to this is linked to questions of, on the one hand, questions of, what is intelligence? And there are some sort of deep philosophical debates that we're having at the moment. Is, how much do we as a society want technology to constrain and augment our behaviors? And there's a lot of ethical questions that society itself is still grappling with. And basically, what law is, if you think about law, it's a codification of ethics at the end of the day, right? You have a set of ethics at a particular point of time. And what law does is it takes these vague ethical concepts and it puts them into essentially in database terms. It normalizes them, right? That's what law is. Right? It's a normalization of a set of ethics at any particular point in society's history. So law will evolve to effectively reflect the ethical position. And I think what happens is a lot of software vendors, it's very easy to talk about ethics because it's an opinion, right? And you can make it very high and mighty and say, we think computers should do the right thing. We think, we're going to be responsible. We're going to be, we're going to treat your data carefully. You can have all these vague, noble, ethically sounding statements. But it's how do you take that ethically sounding statement and turn it into a meaningful sense of accountability? And this is for me where I think the grappling at the moment is with AI. When people say that there's no regulation for AI, they're being disingenuous because their human behavior is regulated in so many ways. And just because you apply AI to that human behavior doesn't make the existing regulatory environment go away. There is a lot to sort out. One at the moment is if you look at the behavior of many of the LLM vendors in terms of how they're treating copyright. You take a book somebody wrote and, did they give you permission to build their model, to train their model on that book? No. And, it's going to be very interesting to see how copyright law resolves that. Does copyright law change to adapt to a new social norm? Or does the copyright law take that on and say, hang on a minute, OpenAI or ABC, what you're doing is wrong and you're going to have to pay. So it's going to be super interesting to see how this evolves. But, I'm more confident that law will figure this out than I think many of the techno bros are.
The logical extension of that argument is that we can't stop at asking the question, what is intelligence? We have to extend that question to what does it mean to be a human? And I'd say the cynics among us would say we got the artificial part right, but we haven't gotten the intelligent part. And when we think about adjudicating this stuff, your comments implied that if digital labor is responsible for, let's say, introducing bias into the hiring process, it should be held liable or responsible like a human would. If that's the case, are the courts or are we as society prepared to begin treating digital labor or holding it to the same standards as we would output created by humans?
At the end of the day, that there's still a human behind it somewhere, right? So there's always ultimately if there's a piece of technology and it's being deployed, some human somewhere decides to deploy technology ABC to do that thing. We're not at a point where the software has agency itself in law, right? If you think about, you do agents, right? There's a concept in law of an agent, and it's different in the concept of what it is in software, but it's got a lot of similarities. I delegate somebody to be my agent at law, and that person I'm then responsible for what that agent does on my behalf. So I'm too lazy to sign this document, or I'm too lazy to do whatever. It's somebody else to do it for me. At the end of the day, I'm responsible for what that person signs, right? And it's a similar metaphor in the software, I think. And I think what we might find happening is that people are a bit more cautious about what they build when they realize that they may be held. It's weird that in almost every other industry, if I build something and it damages society or damages people, then I'm liable for it, right? So if I build a bridge and it falls over, I'm then, I'm then liable for that, and I'll get sued or I'll get deregistered as an engineer or whatever. Right? Whereas, I can build a piece of software and it creates harm, and we haven't been as quick yet to understand that implication. But I think as software creates more harms, then the societal pressure for the people that make software that harms people will increase. So I expect at some point we'll have stronger software liability, stronger software liability regulations. And I'd welcome that.
So extend this conversation out, maybe, I don't know, arbitrarily, I'll say a decade, and talk to me about what's the changing nature of humans' relationship with machines when output that we thought was completely dependent on people now is co-created by machines. And just by way of historical context, I mean, this isn't a new conversation. Think back to, England in the 18th century, and the Luddites broke machines because we had this complicated relationship with machines. And the obvious thing was just to go and take a sledgehammer to them. It's a little more complicated right now with AI, and we're not sure if it's a way to accelerate productivity. Is it going to hold us back? Is it going to take our jobs? What's going to happen in terms of this complicated relationship? Just call it, in a short time frame, 10 years.
I don't really know. And I think, anyone that knows is probably going to be wrong. Anyone who thinks they know today is probably going to be wrong because, these things move. These things move sometimes quicker than we expect, sometimes slower than we expect. I mean, we've had people promising, we have automated autonomous driving. We've had promises of that for some time, and I don't feel like we're significantly closer than where we were 5 years ago. We're a bit closer, but I think we're still a long way away from true autonomous driving. So I'm hesitant to predict what that looks like, but I think we'll have a much more nuanced relationship with AI, and we'll be both less skeptical and less optimistic. We'll be much more realistic in terms of how we work with AI. How that looks, I don't really know, and I'm hesitant to guess. But AI will be much more embedded into our daily existences. In the similar, I remember when I was a kid, there was only one phone in the house. And if you wanted to phone a girl, I didn't know any girls, so I couldn't phone any, but assuming that I did, there was only going to be 15 minutes that I'd be allowed to use the phone because, my dad might be getting a work call or something coming in, And, when you explain that to kids today, it seems to them totally ludicrous. How did you even live? And we'll be having some discussion like that about AI in 10 years' time. How did we do things without it? But I just don't know what that's going to be like.
Unbelievably, we're about out of time, but I hate to cut this one short. We might have to pick this up in a second version, Thomas.
We can do that.
I'm going to force that on you. I'm going to hold you to that offer. But I'm not letting you off the hot seat without one last question. Just feel like this conversation led to this crescendo, so I got to get your take on this. So let's assume there's a time in the not too distant future when call it a silicon-based or an avatar of Thomas Otter can have a similar conversation, maybe even in a more eloquent fashion with a silicon-based version of Dan Turchin. And the carbon-based versions of us are no longer needed. We're on a beach sipping Mai Tais together while our digital twins are having recording a podcast. Is that a good thing? And should we as a society be prepared for this? Should we be intimidated by it, embrace it? Is it inevitable? What's your take on that version of the future?
So I'm cool with that because I think what will be happening is, so there's two parts of which I'm cool about. There's one part of which I'm super cool about, the one part which terrifies me. And the first thing that I'm cool about is that when we think about getting technology to do stuff on our behalf, whatever that is, we think about the stuff that needs to be done as today's stuff that needs to be done. So when we started to see early automation in Greek, with Archimedes and all that kind of stuff, they just imagined, okay, hey, these machines are going to help us, lift water out of a well, right? That's going to be so cool. What they didn't know is that machines will create all kinds of new wants and demands and desires and opportunities for us. And that's what that's what's going to happen as we go forward with technology, whether it's AI or whether it's other forms of technology. Technologies empower new wants, new desires, new opportunities, and so there'll be all sorts of new opportunities. I don't think we will be I think you've done a Mai Tai version of the Keynesian quote. I don't think that we'll all be sitting around doing nothing. I think we'll all be doing something and we'll be busy. What that is, I don't quite know. What does worry me is, where does the value capture of AI go? Does the value capture of AI help create a more equal and fairer society, or does it create a greater sense of inequality? And for me, I think that's the biggest question that as a society we need to look at as we think about AI and what it can create for society is, what sort of society do we want? Do we want a society where AI helps the poorest people be lifted up? Or do we want an AI which makes, a few people even more powerful and even richer? And, it's arrogant as we are, we're all 1% people. I would like to see an AI that helps everybody in the world, not just the lucky ones that happen to have gone to Stanford and done, started whatever startup. I want to see AI be a force for an egalitarian uplift rather than extraordinary wealth creation for a very few number of people.
Thomas, we're going to pick up the conversation right where we're leaving off in the second version. This has been a lot of fun. These are such important topics, and we're just getting started. So thank you much for coming and hanging out.
Thanks, Dan. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Where can the audience follow you and your musings?
So if you just look up thomas.otter at acadianventures.com, that's my email. And then if you just search Thomas Otter, you'll probably find me. There's two Thomas Otters, actually. There's a German professor of marketing, Frankfurt University, and there's me. But I'm the one that has the Substack ramblings about HR tech.
That and David Bowie.
Yeah, I do like Mr. Bowie. He is really rather special.
Excellent. Well, Thomas,
I don't think AI could ever have invented David Bowie.
We're gonna debate that one. We're gonna add that to the topic list for the next conversation.
Yeah.
Fascinating topics. All right, Thomas, this has been great. Gosh, that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from People Rain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.